Salam, Namaste, and welcome to today's event at Indian Diaspora, Washington, D.C. Metro. Today we are going to hear Professor Sukrita Kumar, a very well-known academic, a poet, author, translator, and former Aruna Asif Chair at Delhi University. She will be formally introduced by Professor Girja Sharma, who is a former chair and professor of English department and dean faculty of languages at Himachal Pradesh University. She herself is a well-known reviewer, translator, author, and editor of many books. Professor Sukrita Kumar is a very well-known poet and author, and she is going to speak on Speaking for Myself, the Dynamic of Resilience in Asian Women's Writing. And the concluding remark will be given by Dr. Basudhara Roy, who is an assistant professor in Department of English at Karim College, which is associated with the Kolan University, Chaibasa in Jharkhand. She herself is a poet, I think a collection of 3 books and a book reviewer. I have seen the articles in, I think, Scroll and The Wire, etc. So formally, Professor Girja Sharma is going to now introduce Professor Sukrita Kumar. And so welcome you all. Thank you. Ji, Girja ji.
Thank you, Razi Sahab. Good morning and good evening to our friends in India. Thank you very much, Razi Sahab, for having me over on this prestigious forum. I'm deeply honored to introduce Professor Sukrita Kumar, who in fact needs no introduction. A highly acclaimed poet, an academic, a painter, author, translator, and editor. She was born in Kenya to the academician mother Krishna and the renowned Urdu writer Joginder Paul. Before she moved to India, along with her parents, she had spent 15 long years in Nairobi. Thus, the calling from Africa, as she puts it, has remained a part of her vibrant persona. Having had an enviable career as an academic, Professor Sukrita held Aruna Asif Chair at Delhi University and formerly was a fellow at Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla. She was invited at the prestigious International Writing Program at Iowa, US, was honorary faculty at Dural Center at Corfu, Greece, and an honorary fellow at the HK Baptist University, Hong Kong. A Charles Wallace visitor to the UK as a poet scholar, she was also awarded visitorship at Concordia University, Canada. Representing India at the BRICS Summit in China in 2018, and then as the director of a UNESCO project on the culture of peace, her role in building bridges where none exist has been exemplary. The latest in the series of awards that Professor Sukrita has received is the prestigious Rabindranath Tagore Literary Prize that was conferred upon her in December 2023 by US-based Maitreya Publishing Foundation. Professor Sukrita's brilliant poetic career spanning over 4 decades is marked by publication of several anthologies, including Salt and Pepper, Vanishing Words, Dream Catcher, Untitled, 7 Leaves One Autumn, Poems Come Home, which is a bilingual book and has been translated by none other than Gulzar, the famous poet. Besides this, she has also many other books, other publications to her credit. The list is really long, so because of time constraint, I will mention only a few of them. Narrating partition, texts, interpretations, ideas, The new story, a study of literary modernism in Urdu and Hindi short fiction, conversations on modernism, dialogues with writers, critics, and philosophers, Man, Woman, and Androgyny, a study of the novels of Theodore Dreiser, Scott Fitzgerald, and Ernest Hemingway. Among the major co-edited volumes are Ismat, Her Life in Times, Joginder Paul, stories which have been given the subtitle The Dying Sun, then Speaking for Myself, an anthology of Asian women's writings, co-edited with Malatri Lal and published by Penguin India. Currently, Professor Sukrita is the guest editor of the prestigious journal Indian Literature and also the series editor of Writer in Context series along with Chandana Datta, which is being published by Routledge. Today's talk by Professor Sukrita Paul Kumar at Indian Diaspora Washington DC Metro Forum is on Speaking for Myself, the Dynamics of Resilience in Asian Women's Writings. Her interest in women's writings has existed as a seamless continuum since her book on Ismat Chugtai was published. In the foreword to this brilliant book, Speaking for Myself, the legendary Kapila Vatsyayan refers to what she calls, and I quote, the humble art of the needle and the thread, creating and sustaining a vibrant cultural dialogue. More specifically, she elaborates later, the Kantha, which most of us know about, is an embroidery form popular in the Eastern India, is the piecing together of fragments into a whole through that needle and thread, whereby the stories of life and death, of ritual, of obedience and dissent are stitched together to speak a language of beauty, to speak a language that crosses borders. How beautifully does it remind us of quilting that African American women and African women as a whole practice as a mode of expression to their creativity and how it keeps them together. Perhaps there's no better way to define this book, comprising writings of women from Central Asia to the Far East, from the Indian subcontinent to Southeast Asia and West Asia. An inherently eclectic collection of literary pieces. Speaking for Myself makes a subtle but powerful statement about the creative impulse as a strategy for survival in the face of pain, deprivation, and oppression. Putting many a myth on trial, these poems and stories interrogate regressive traditions and are voices of assertion. The new addition to this anthology seems to address some extremely pertinent issues by bringing attention, observe the editors, about the razor edge of violence, unquote, as the boundaries between nations, to quote the editors again, have become sites of human rights violations and political questioning, unquote. In the poem entitled From the Diary of an Almost 4-Year-Old, from this section, which was newly introduced in the book, by a Palestinian poet, Hanan Mikhail Ashravi, is evident a palpable sense of menace, a foreboding of a disaster that was waiting to happen. I conclude with excerpts from the poem written much earlier. Today, the poem hits us even harder as we hear about thousands of innocent children perishing in Gaza. I quote a few first lines from the poem and the last lines later on. It's a boy who has lost his eye because of a bullet injury, and how he speaks. Tomorrow, the bandages will come off. I wonder, will I see half an orange, half an apple, half my mother's face, with my one remaining eye? And then there is the last passage of this poem, which is equally poignant. I hear a 9-month-old has also lost an eye. I wonder if my soldier shot her too. A soldier looking for little girls who look him in the eye. I'm old enough, almost 4. I've seen enough of life, but she's just a baby who didn't know any better. In the backdrop of recent upheavals and patterns of systemic violence that seem to tear apart an already divided and callous world, today we wait for yet another edition of Speaking for Myself, or a sequel to it, with a prayer for peace on our lips. Thank you. Over to you, Professor Sukrita.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for that long introduction, Girija. I don't know how to really get started because, as you mentioned, I have been with the subject, I think, for the last, should I say, 3 decades or 4 decades. And the culmination of it all probably happened eventually in the book Speaking for Myself, partially, and then evolving from there. I also worked on Krishna Sukti extensively. So I have been with the subject for a very long time, and I would like to start by talking a little bit about counter archives that get created in literature. And personally, I believe that the narratives of women have been, like, to at least to me, like counter archival material, which has a kind of a futuristic intent, because these are in fact archives which have been they've come out of a mindset which has always probably been under the huge oppressive umbrella of patriarchy. And particularly in literature, where you see either, I mean, I'm talking about the mainstream literature, where you have either idealization of the female figure, or you have very reductive, essentialist notions which get perpetuated by patriarchy. And women become spectacles, almost spectacles, till such time as people like Sidsu, for instance, come to the fore and talk about how is the body written. Writing the body is what she calls it. And there is a certain kind of a self-awareness that gets to be witnessed in the writings of women, which normally are either suppressed completely or are marginalized completely. And the strategies of conformity get highlighted rather than the rebellious nature of the archives that I'm talking about. And when I say archives, I'm very clear that these are the archives that have, as I said, futuristic intent. And by that, I mean that they are looking at a future which is even more kind of positive vis-a-vis the understanding of what gender is all about. So these archives are disruptive of the conventional narratives, the dominant normative kind of narratives. And also there is a kind of, what gets recorded is a spirit of resistance to, in a way, destabilize the linear flow of time. And also it gets into the whole domain of dehistoricizing a past. I go to my favorite writer, Krishna Sukti, who in fact mentions it loud and clear when she says, the romance of life is not in a straight line. And she herself was soaked in a past because she was very, very concerned about what history is all about. But she responded very sharply to the political present. which of course, within which she wrote novels like Mitro Marjani, with the defiance, kind of tone, language that is used by her protagonist Mitro, where she's actually projecting female desire, and was obviously not very popular in the initial stages in as far as the reception of the novel is concerned. But contemporary to her, and probably a little earlier than her, had come Ismat Chugtai in Urdu. And I had done some work long ago, I would say nearly about 2 decades away. I had done a book on her called Ismat, Her Life, Her Times, as you mentioned, Girija. In this book, what I noticed was that a lot of things that were getting either prescribed or not prescribed, whether in Hindi or Urdu or in English in the universities, a lot of times it was just the sensational value of a story like Lihaf, the quilt, which got prescribed and had very sharp reactions because of the projection of the 2 main characters, of the love situation, not even love, but a physical relationship that seemed to have been projected by Ismat Chugtai very boldly in 1942. Now, there were very sharp reactions. Either people really upheld it as a great story, but the majority of them wanted to tear it apart. And in fact, Ismat's words are that when she would open the envelopes, there were no emails at that time, she would open the envelopes of the responses of the letters that had come to her. And what would she find? She said always there were snakes and worms, never petals of flowers and, harmony of any kind in the tone, in the language that was used by people, the readers of that particular story. However, in the recent times, we know that that story has been venerated and prescribed everywhere as a wonderful story, a bold story by her. But what was she trying to do? I think what she was trying to do is to bring around some kind of ordinariness on the one hand, projection of ordinariness, ordinary life, ordinary people in the courtyard, for instance, women in the courtyard. She would bring them out into the domain of writing, and writing to her, like to many other writers, female writers, was in fact an act of, it was feminist in spirit, because otherwise writing was not seen to be something that a woman would be doing, though there have been very many women writers, but women would never get projected as agency in their writings. Now, Ismat Chugtai, when she started writing, I remember reading this somewhere, that she would hide her writings under the pillow because Azim Beg Chugtai, who was her brother, would always forbid her from writing. And once when he saw one story by her, he was very upset because he said, "What the hell are you trying to do? What kind of language is this? This is the language of women, and why are you using this?" Because the poetics that he was following, and he was a writer, he was following were very patriarchal Persian poetics of the times, which were very prevalent. So what did she do? Where did she get this language from? She would hide under the bed. She would hide behind the doors and listen to the conversation of gossip and scandal and all that was going on in the inner courtyard by the aunts and the grandmothers who lived in that big house in the Haveli. And she picked up a language from there, and she would write a story replicating that scene, and of course with her own androgynous spirit of projecting that story as a powerful story, because the characters emerged very powerfully. And what is that language that came to be? The language was called, people started venerating it again, emulating it, and that was called Begumati Zuban. Now this Zuban, the Zuban of the women, did not have the poetic license, did not have the validity that, men's language had, which was appropriated also by women writers. But some of these women, and I can very easily think of Krishna Sopti doing it in Hindi, Ismat Chugtai doing it in Urdu, Amrita Pritam doing it in Punjabi, Mahashweta Devi doing it in Bengali. I'm only talking about the Indian writers, but if you go to even Pakistan across the border, you have Kishwar Nahid, who wrote this wonderful book in the form of poetry, We the Sinful Women. And incidentally, just as I was waiting for this program to start, I happened to get a recording of my friend's poem, and my friend being Nirupama Dutt. And her poem is called, it's a Punjabi poem, and it's called Buri Aurat, where she's actually loud and clear saying that I am a Buri Aurat in the eyes of the world. And why? And this is because she's stepping into the domain of action. Whatever action that she does is as men's action, seen as men's action. So she's branded as a Buri Aurat, she says in the poem. And she's proud to be. And my reaction to that was, when I listened to that poem, I wrote to her, I said, may there be many such Buri Aurats, all over the world. Because that's where you see the real guts, the real element of assertion, of being. And this is what our Krishna Sotri tried to do all her life. Respect the autonomy of being and not be repressed under historical versions of what a woman should be, the sociological conditioning that was so prevalent, not only in life, in the living of life, but also in the world of literature. Unless, of course, we were to look at the ancient bhakti movement, where you see writers like Lal Ded, not even writers, that remained in the oral domain for a very long time, where Mahadevi Akka, where all these women saints would come onto the streets of their cities or wherever they existed and sing the song of autonomy. I don't have examples to give you right now, but actually they would abuse the husband who had repressed them and in defiance walk out into the streets in order to, I think it's Arundhati Subramaniam who calls them wild women, because wildness is not a trait a woman is supposed to have. She would be debunked as a hysterical, mad woman in the attic, as somebody said. This brings me to this whole notion of what is gynocriticism. And this was a term that was used in the 70s and 80s by the American feminists. And they said, we have to use the lens, the gender lens, to examine literature, because it is in literature that one can discerningly pinpoint as to who has, which is the woman who is not being listened to, but all because she has asserted her own autonomy with dignity of being. So if we are thinking of that and sort of basically go to Elaine Showalter, who actually describes as to how, if you look at the different steps of how this resilience, if we may say, the dynamics of it came to be in the understanding that women writers project as far as feminism is concerned, it begins with effeminate kind of writing, perhaps knowledge of effeminate writing, where a woman is supposed to be passive and is supposed to act the role of being a typical mother or a daughter or a wife. And so that is feminism of a certain, not feminism, but it's basically effeminate kind of writing. The second stage comes to be when the woman realizes, the writer realizes, I have to find my own voice. And where is that own voice? It first of all comes to it within the range of her own experience, where even the personal can become political, because when you're talking about your very private, personal emotions, and if you are writing about that, that in itself is a feminist act. And from there evolves what Elaine Showalter calls the female protagonist, female with an androgynous vision. And this androgyny also I worked on long time ago, and that was when I did my PhD, and I was looking at androgynous characters in 3 American authors. And my point is that the point I'm making is that actually when I'm making this presentation, I feel as though I'm speaking for myself. which is how my feminism has slowly, understanding of feminism has slowly been evolving with time, I think. And this is to do with how I have linked the ancient past, from where I hear the vachanas of Mahadevi Akka, to the medieval times, to the present times, by looking at Isma Chugtai, Krishna Sokti, Kurutul and Haider, and writers of this ilk, who are actually discovering their sense of being and sense of self, through which I am acquiring my sense of self as well. So I think this kind of a perpetuation of a certain kind of feminism was far beyond the reductive, essentialist kind of notions that were getting perpetuated by patriarchal kind of writing in the earlier kind of literature, or the mainstream. I won't say early or late, because it's almost cyclic as we see it. So the point I'm making is here that I think it's very important to destabilize the linear flow, the way the flow had been going on as far as the mainstream is concerned. And there have been great interventionists, even within our own country, where we find that people set up, people like Urvashi Butalia and Ritu Menon, they actually set up feminist presses. In the West too, there are a whole lot of feminist presses with non-commercial ideas, but just with a sense of mission to change the scene. And this is what becomes then the site of resistance to the dominant archive of power and authority, which is also kind of encouraged by patriarchy more and more. So I would personally feel that it's very, very important to look at this material. And when we go to the book, why not also introduce this book, Speaking for Myself, to you? When Malashri Lal, my friend, and I were in a way told to do this book, it was the command of the cultural icon Kapila Vatsyayan to us, who was heading Asia Project in India International Center. She called me over and she said, look, I want you people to get busy over the next maybe 2 years, but you have to do this book, which is to do with women's narratives from Asia. Are you going to be able to do it? We thought it was not going to be difficult, just look around a little bit here and there in our libraries and in the bookshops and get the right books and put some writings together. And Mala and I thought it was going to be extremely easy doing the book. But lo and behold, do we talk to our neighbors? Are we getting their books in our bookshops? Even if it is the neighbor, like we know the whole story about Pakistan, how we are not even exchanging books or written material. But leave aside Pakistan, we don't even get material from Indonesia or Singapore or further, east or west in Asia. Do we get books in translation in English or in the original? In any case, it will not matter if we were to have it because have books in their languages, because nobody would know those languages. So there is a certain kind of a construct with which the sociology here and the academia has functioned for ever so long, which is there is a very clear notion that what is important is to read what comes out of the West, whether it is literature or science or anything else. So where is the material? If you want to read material from Asia, what do? We had a lot of problems. It just so happened that, there were some travels that we were involved in at that time as scholars. I happened to be in Macau, for instance, near Hong Kong. And in Macau, I found couple of very beautiful books of short stories, which were short stories from Macau. And one of the best stories that we have, and in fact also not just stories of Macau, but a Tibetan story that we found in one of the volumes. It is by Gi Yang, and it is there in this volume that we have of Speaking for Myself. And this Tibetan story is something that actually, sort of baffles one in trying to understand as to what kind of a energy that gets projected by the female protagonist of this particular story. This is a story that is called An Old Nun tells her story. And I will not tell the story, but I will just tell you I'll just read out one particular statement from there. And this is how it goes. We tell stories about our lives of suffering, but we are not victims. Everything that we talk about, everything, all the suffering that we narrate becomes beautiful in writing. So there you are. We are talking about an aesthetics. So even if it is suffering, it is not as a victim who suffers, but they seem to be coming out as polished gold after the suffering. These protagonists, with the kind of awareness, self-reflexivity of what that suffering has yielded to them. So this is such an insightful story. And similarly, one of the stories, another story that we read, which was from Macau, and which is included in this volume, is by Maria Ondina. And this is called Lepers. And in this, there is one statement that I would like to quote. We live, these are lepers, mind you, we live even if we are marked by death. So what can suffering do? What kind of resilience is shown here? And what kind of awareness that comes out? There is all through in this selection that we made. And these were not just accidental findings, of the stories, the kind of stories that we ended up getting. We discovered that there was a journal that came out of Hawaii. And I had been invited for something else to Hawaii. And as I go there and find out, about what kind of literature is being taught and practiced out there, I find that there is a journal called Manoa, M-A-N-O-A, which comes out of Hawaii from the East-West Center. And in that journal, there are special issues of literature from Indonesia, literature from Philippines, literature from China. So and that was in English. So some of our stories come from that particular journal. And that journal is not available in India. So such is the destiny of scholars who want to really work on Asian literature. It's very, very difficult. So to my mind, this volume becomes a very important volume from the point of view of accessing literature from all these countries. And the number of countries that we managed to cover was 34. And that is why I feel very proud of this volume that we managed to do. And one of the stories is, it's a haunting play, actually, which is included, a short play that is included in this volume. And this play is called Marsina. And this is from Sumatra, if you please. This is by Ratna Sarumpet. And what happens in this play? There is a feminist activist who has been murdered. And her indomitable spirit does not die. Her death brings back the abstraction of almost like a ghost and in the dialogue form of the character called Marsina. And Marsina is talking about taking revenge after her death. And this is actually a battle against patriarchy and a whole questioning of why a woman who is an activist, who is a feminist, would be killed. So this opens up another whole domain. So on the one hand, we are talking about very specific countries and the cultures. And I go back to the point that I was trying to make, which Edward Said had talked about as to how damaging it is to create the Orientalist vision. Nevertheless, what I want to say here is that as far as the literatures are concerned, there is no doubt that the general understanding by the Western educated scholars, the understanding of what an Indian woman or what an Indonesian woman or any of the women from the Asian countries would be projected. What would be the vision? That of a passive woman. Not a woman who's a fighter, not a woman who, for instance, in the Chinese story, there is a Chinese story here also included in, I'm trying to locate that statement, but this is a story of a woman who is part of that program that is going on in Tiananmen Square at the time of the rebellion there. And she says, hey, listen, we exist. We women also exist. Why are you not paying attention to us? And then she gives a kind of a feminist speech, which is not very overtly feminist, but the strategy is that of asserting a feminist fervor of making the other realize that we exist. So it's like, breaking barriers. It's like finding new language. I remember being very interested in the finding of new women's language long ago by poets like Sylvia Plath and later Adrienne Rich and so on. Women poets who were trying to, in America, locate a language of women. Because unless you have your own vocabulary, unless you deconstruct the male constructs, it's very difficult to find, the genuine right experience articulated in the proper words. So the constructs had to be in an abstract way deconstructed, and the mythology had to be demythologized. And that is why you have an Indian story like Draupadi, for instance, which is by Mahashweta Devi. Because the Draupadi of Mahashweta Devi is very different from the Draupadi of Mahabharata. Draupadi here is actually asserting herself, her nakedness to the person who, Senapati, who has designs of raping her. And she says, okay, here you are, I'm naked, do what you like. And the way she says it and the way she throws off her clothes, that in itself becomes a weapon for him to feel very timid, and he does not do it. So it's these strategies, the way they are played out, and you see a certain kind of heroism there, which is normally assigned to a man, and the woman becomes the victim. So it is these stories that we picked up. Though in the case of Mahashweta Devi, we didn't take this story. We took up another story, which is called Giribala. So that is what she had been doing all through. And in as far as Pakistan is concerned, who can deny the fact that somebody like Kishwar Nahid, who wrote that whole volume, We the Sinful Women, she actually played a very great role in talking about how women are suppressed under the cover of tradition and are not allowed to voice their own angst in the way that they want to. So as a result, what has happened? That the greater the suppression, the greater the rebellion in poetry. That is literature for you. Because a counter archive happens. But if it is the male bastion that you see of criticism, then those voices also get repressed. So it's people, many of us who are working in this particular domain, we are looking at material which is going to counter the mainstream in such a way that this acquires a voice of its own. It acquires legitimacy, and not just legitimacy, and not just validation, but it should be given a proper space. Now, within that domain, you also see, for instance, in India, you have Dalit feminism happening. So there is a tremendous amount of heterogeneity of voices that you see. It's not homogenization of the term feminism, and therefore one kind of character getting evolved and presenting over and over again in fiction, in literature, and so on. It's not that. The contexts are different, and from within those specific contexts, new voices appear, and new voices of strength appear, primarily because literature caters to that. That is why freedom is required. Freedom of expression is required. And Dalit feminism is something that I think all of us venerate tremendously. Why? Because they are doubly colonized in one sense. One is caste and the other is gender. And how do they break through that? So it is one thing to come to the streets with slogans and have the Panther movement and everything that has its own role that is played by the activists. But here is the writer who, for instance, stands up, somebody like Bama, it writes in Tamil. And she has no fears of writing in a dialect, which is her own dialect of her own region. And in that dialect, she paints the picture of caste oppression. First caste oppression and then gender expression. And the intersection that you see in her work, called Karuku, for instance, is how life is like thorns hitting at you, and you are full of those wounds, and yet you want to survive, yet you want to fight it out. And so whether it is Sangati by her or her book Karuku, we know how she manages to be heard. And I happen to be on the jury when once there was an award institute, I think it was Crossword Award. And she was at that time very new to literature. Her first book was Karuku, which she had written. And I was in the jury. I remember how much of a discussion we had. This was translated by Lakshmi Holmstrom from the Tamil dialect to English. Thank God she did it, because all of us are now privy to it. And I happen to now also put it as part of a text which I created for Delhi University students, and many students are reading that particular text today. So the point I'm trying to make is that, it is up to us, how do we use the gender lens? I think it's very important to look at the gender lens in such a way so that we are not only looking at going beyond the binaries, but we are also looking at how we have to question heteronormativity also. How do we look at the sexual pluralities? How do we look at homophobia? And how does that get presented in literature? How do those deep-seated notions, which are culturally sometimes, presented to you right from your childhood, and you swallow them, internalize them. How do you break those structures of patriarchy? And how do you realize that your own sexuality is getting controlled that way? And therefore, how do you escape the technology of surveillance also? And how do we then realize the fluidity that gender identities present to us in life as such? The historical eraser has to be questioned. Homogenization has to be questioned. It is a lot of that kind of a material that you see within poetry. You do see it in short stories. And now we are asking ourselves, why are we looking at literature? Why are we looking at Asian? We have to ask these questions. Why do we do that? Why are we looking at gender? We know that it is something so basic to human life. And that is why it would be sad, whether it is this session or generally, when men do not feel attracted to sessions like this or classroom readings. You find many times if there are gender programs happening, the majority would be that of women. Nowadays, yes, a few men are getting interested. The gender equation is changing a little bit. Hopefully, more and more of that would happen. But what I'm trying to say is that it has to be an inclusive movement, a revolution of the mind. And the revolution will probably happen only if there is an evolution of the thought process. How does this evolution happen? How does this evolution happen? It can happen very effectively through storytelling. And for that, of course, our own Asian countries revel in that much more than the Western counterpart. We know that I hope it keeps happening, our grandmothers, our mothers are storytelling, are very fond of telling stories to their children. And I do hope that practice is not replaced totally by the television or the idiot box, or if at all it is even there has to be a dose of feminist gender awareness all the time. If it is not there, it's very difficult to evolve a point of view which can actually change us from within internally. And if we do not change, I don't think we can progress very much, no matter how much of technology we have all around. The demystification of women is necessary. Lesser of romanticization but greater of the realistic projection of what a woman, what a man is all about, and what is the in-between of the two binaries. What is the in-between is also very important. So what I really want to again and again emphasize is that no matter whether it is somebody like Krishna Sopti, and how can I not mention the wonderful novel that she wrote called Samay Sargam. Unfortunately, that novel is not as much talked about as some of her other works, but I would like to point it out for that reason itself, that it is a neglected novel. It is in this novel that she's talking about how does aging together, it's too, she, by the way, she got married. This has an autobiographical element about it. She was 70 when she got 70 when she got married to a man who was himself 70. So they married, and a little later, she, after having realized how aging together was happening after this marriage, she wrote this novel called Samay Sargam. And it is that beauty of aging which she has captured, which actually transcends sexual desire, but it emphasizes on companionship because of the practice of equality between the two of them. Each respects the other's autonomy. And in this novel, you see that portrayed so well, that you want to get married at that age or have a relationship of equality. And equality would lead to harmony all around that. And I remember she told me once herself, because I was very close to her, and she would tell me, she says, look, it's so beautiful. I go to sleep early in the morning at about 5 o'clock because all through the night I'm writing. And her husband would, at that time, be getting up because he would sleep at 9 p.m. every day. So perfect, So he would be sleeping and she would be working, and so there was that silence, that space given to each other to write, to be alone to write. There was an understanding, some to respect each other's habits or timings, and not having no extra demands on each other. So it's a very beautiful novel that she writes. It's the same person who wrote Mitro Marjani. It's the same person who also writes that wonderful, absolutely wonderful dialogue that you have in the book called, it's a long dialogue. It's a novel of a long dialogue. It's a book called Ae Ladki. And in Ae Ladki, what is she doing? It's the old ailing mother in dialogue with her daughter. So there are fights. It's a dialogue which is so enlightening. There are fights between the two of them. There are moments when they are so enlightened suddenly, of some flash of insight that comes to them, of understanding what life is all about. So what is that dialogue? And that reminds me of another very beautiful story. And why would I not mention it here? This is a story from, I think it is Azerbaijan. Yes, that's the story that I want to tell you. It's a story called Sparrows in English translation. And in this story, what is so beautiful is that it is shown as to how the female protagonist there liberates herself from the idealized motherhood that exists all around, the mythology of it all. So when she has her own aspirations, for a long time, she's repressing it because she's taking care of her baby. Even after the baby has become a full-grown, adolescent child. So the daughter's point of view has been projected in that story to see how her mother finds her own sky to fly in. And her own sky, that's why it's called Sparrow, because she then decides to shed the romanticized notion of motherhood and find her own self in the world and in the sky to fly in. So it's, again, a very beautiful story. And that also is included in the book, Speaking for Myself. So I wish there will be there would be more and more people reaching out for this book, because there are stories from, or poetry from Philippines, from Cambodia, from Mongolia, all these places which otherwise it's impossible to get literatures in the libraries from these, in English translation from these various countries. So my area of interest has been to look at how, for instance, from Rashid Jahan to Ismet Chugtai to Kurutul and Heather, and all these people like Krishna Softi and Amrita Pritam, they had a feud together. And in as far as Kurutul and Heather and Ismet Chugtai is concerned, they had a bout between the two of them of differences, and yet they are both such wonderful writers, very different from each other. One standing for the so-called progressivism, the other one being seen as a modernist, Kurutul and Heather as a modernist. In fact, Ismet Chugtai writes an article on her called Pom Pom Darling. And I want to read that article. It's like she's going berserk, actually, Ismet Chugtai, in that, by criticizing Kurutul and Heather for being Western educated person who, as she comes here, dolled up from the West, she comes to India, and she projects her feminism in a particular way. And Ismet doesn't like that, because she's a realist, and she wants, as a progressive, she wants her to come into the social domain in a different way, not as an isolated, alienated kind of a writer. So she writes about her, and she says she is a pom-pom darling. And pat comes the reply of Kurutul and Heather. And I have included that article of hers in my book called Ismet, Her Life, Her Times. And she wrote on Ismet Chugtai, and she said, so Ismet Chugtai, you are Lady Changiz Khan. And why does she say that? Because Ismet Chugtai herself had always said that her lineage was from two sides. One was the Sufi side, and the other was Changiz dynasty. And so she, Kurutul and Heather, like an abuse, says, oh, you are Lady Changiz Khan, aggressive, loud, and not sophisticated like Kurutul and Heather. But these were two stalwarts, which I think we have to remember them all again and again, and try to understand what was the difference and what is the beauty of each one of them and their literatures. Same is true of Amrita Pritam and Krishna Softi. So there are these so many pairs that you see out here, and they're not the only ones. I know Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi literature a little bit. I would say only a little bit, but still, since I know them, I'm able to pinpointedly talk about this in this fashion. But what I'm trying to say is that their presence, in fact, was so strong, these women, they were so strong that a lot of male bashing happened at that time, because they were not being given adequate space in literature. But they were so resilient that they found their space on their own merit, and wrote and spoke and critiqued other people. And we know today that people like me are writing on them. And there are students of mine who have done PhDs on these authors. And I feel very proud that we have writers like that. And one, before I forget, Krishna Softi, another point that she did was she also used, she did not want to be existing under the shackles of gender. So she said, yes, I'm a woman, but I will assume, I will get male voice to write a series of articles which she wrote, not just articles, there were narratives on other people that she had encountered in her life. And that was called series of 4 volumes that she created. This was called Hum Hashmat, asserting that she is Hashmat, the man writer Hashmat. So why did she do that? She just wanted to, she said she actually felt when she was doing these, whenever she would want to acquire that voice and write in a male voice, she would write a piece as Hashmat and acquire a different style. She says her pen moved like that of a man. Her handwriting changed. She internalized it so much. Isn't this what Virginia Woolf said? A writer has to be androgynous, half male, half female. And that is why Vishnu Prabhakar wrote in Hindi a novel called Ardhanareshwar. And that novel is talking about, it's a whole discursive novel talking about androgyny. What is androgyny? Who wants to become the androgynous writer? What is the meaning of it all? Again, we linked that with the Greek mythology of androgyny, and we universalize that mythology, which actually gets deconstructed by some of these people. So some of these writers. I think that would do for the moment, Razi Saab, wouldn't it? And shall we move on?
Wonderful, wonderful. Really, it was quite mesmerizing and we enjoyed every bit of that. Let's have the concluding remark coming from Dr. Vasudhara Roy. Are you here? Vasudhara ji. And then we can go into the question answer session.
Is she there? No?
Hello.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Come on. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone, and good morning to everyone in the US. And this has been one brilliant session. What a very, very mesmerizing presentation, Sukrita ma'am. She has, I think you have not left anything out. It would be very difficult to summarize a lecture which has been as exhaustive as this, which has also been as liberating as this, I would say. So there have been, there have been discussions on the subject before, but I think what is very outstanding about this particular session is the way that both Eastern and Western feminist critical perspectives have been brought together. What is very exceptional about this particular lecture was the interweaving, of the various vernacular, regional, geospatial conditions that Sukrita ma'am brought about. So she has been mentioning writers like Chukdai, like Amrita Pritam, and they also come from very disparate I would say, linguistic locations, from very disparate cultural locations in the country. And this minority, the minor narratives that they weave together are then capable of offering a model of resistance, a model of rebellion, which can be posited against this structure that we call patriarchy, and that can be used to dismantle constructs of womanhood. It is very exceptional that Sukrita ma'am herself should be speaking so, because as a woman writer who has been writing poetry for a long period of time, who has also been a very outstanding critic, we find that these conditions or these minor rebellions are also present in Sukrita Paul Kumar's own writing. So speaking for herself, or speaking for myself, or speaking for Asian womanhood as a whole, this becomes a kind of counter archive, as she began with. So when the session started, Raziuddin sir said that, all men would feel slightly intimidated today. But I think with a feminist like Sukrita Paul Kumar, men need not to be intimidated at all, because as she ends with the very, very productive, very fertile model of androgyny, I think, it brings together into focus the essential aspects of creation, the essential aspects of creativity, the essential aspects also of a joint identity narrative that can be built together. So speaking for myself, of course, has been a very powerful anthology, and Sukrita ma'am has spoken about some very, very significant stories, poems, plays, which appear in the volume. The body, I think, remains very central to speaking for myself, as also to the discussion that Sukrita ma'am brought before us. So the body, I think, has been for Asian women, the idea of the body has been the primarily, it has been the significantly primary site of rebellion, because the body as a vessel, the body as a kind of repository of honor, of izzat, is what has characterized womanhood in the, throughout Asia, not only in the Indian subcontinent, but throughout Asia. So women are receptacles, women are repositories, women are vessels wherein the izzat of the community, of the family, of the religion are all, placed together. And I think it is this model of the body that women writers have been protesting against. It is this autonomy that women writers have been seeking. And part of this also comes from the particular family structures within Asian countries, which also Sukrita Sukrita ma'am pointed out. So the kind of family structures we have, where it is possible for women to come together, women in the zenana, women in the women's quarters, women also in kith and kin relationships, so the grandmother's storytelling. So these family networks between women have been, I believe, a very fertile source of women's relationships, as also women's protests and rebellions. So much of revolt, rebellion, or protest, I would say, in the Asian context, has come out within the site of the family. And it has come out against the body. So family and body, I believe, are the two axes around which, speaking for myself, also revolves. So almost every work here in discussion talks about the family in some ways. So either it is a questioning of the extant model of the family, or it is an advocation of a new model of the family. And the body and sexuality remain very significant questions here. So reclaiming the body would be a way of reclaiming their own space, would be a way of reclaiming their identity, and would be a way of then speaking for themselves. Sukrita ma'am also brought into the session the idea of, the Western model of feminism, show alter, and we are reminded of accretor feminine and speaking through the body, or writing through the body, or the body gynocriticism, and the body as text, the gyno text. And I think all these ideas have been brilliantly brought out in the context of Indian writing in English, or much of writing that has come out from Asia in these last 50 years or so. So overall, I believe this has been one very, very significant session. And the way that all the various models of Indian feminism, of Western feminism, have been brought together under the banner, it offers scope for more discussion in the near future. So thank you very much, Sukrita ma'am, for a very, very rounded session. And thank you to the organizers for conducting this, as also for making us a part of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you all the speakers. So before we go to question answer session, since we do every week some different topics, this is a permanent kind of session. Danish Iqbal comes every month at the end of the month, like the last Saturday of every month. He presents. He's the only one who presents like that. And he brings literature and entertainment together in a very unique way. So this time it is on Raj Kapoor's legacy, and welcome you all on that. So now we enter into question and answer session. And today our moderator is in a meeting somewhere, Dr. Rafat Hussain. So Faisal, are you ready to take on?
Yeah.
Okay. So Faisal will be moderating this session. He will be just accepting the questions and giving to the speakers. Okay, Faisal, thank you.
All right, thank you to all the speakers. For the audience, if you have any questions, you can either put in a chat or raise your digital hand. I have allowed you all to be able to unmute yourself and ask the question. If you raise your digital hand, I will call you to ask your questions. With that, Ms. Shabnam first, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes. So I would like to use the description that Basudhara used of a vessel, and I speak my observations as a womanly vessel, a diasporic one, and imbibing from all the riches that Sukrita ji has bestowed on us today. I'll offer my own observations of my own experience, gleaned from whatever she said. And I feel in this era of transnational, digital, communicative culture, we've all become inherently diasporic and peripatetic. We're all on a rhizomatic quest for identity and belonging. And diasporic cartographies are forged by inhabiting and navigating multiple places, sometimes physically, but sometimes vicariously. And I would also think sometimes liminally. Diaspora is communal, but it's also individuated. And this is where women come in. Our identities have become protean, chameleon-like, improvisational even. And I've observed where I live, which is Pittsburgh in USA, I've observed this phenomenon in ethnic enclaves that you find in big cities, that they are fueled obviously by nostalgia and longing for lost homes, and they're sort of like simulations which have been constructed to gather people who have been scattered or have come here voluntarily or sometimes forced. And then you have the language and art and cuisine, preservation of generational stories, sometimes traumatic stories, all to promote diasporic identity. And a large part of this thriving depends to some extent on the host culture and the host country. Also, it depends on your status. If you come here as household help, you may not have a voice. If you come here as a rich techno-bureaucrat, you will have a large platform. This is just my personal observation. And I think some basic deconditioning is also in order with the terms we use, like border and wall. They are colonial imperial terms, which I would be ambitious enough to want to challenge as fossilized and ossified terms and want to dissolve them, especially in the kind of world we live in today. And as a woman, I think our voices can be very powerful. To raise caution.
Can you mind please conclude? Thank you.
To raise caution urgently, given the rise of fascist ideologies in our post-fact world, where identities are becoming blurred and erased, as Sukrita ji mentioned. And this is happening within the fissures and fault lines created by warring ideologies, as Girija ji mentioned in Gaza. So that's what I had to offer in response to all that was said today. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. For the responders and for the future questioners also, I would request please keep your questions precise and short, and the responder also please, if you could quickly wrap the answers, that would be appreciated. Do you have any response to this, any one of you?
Yeah, I'd like to just sort of compliment you for, challenging the colonial terminology and particularly the word borders, because I think that's again a very feminist act of ours, when we sort of question this, because that is also a kind of an umbrella patriarchal, notions that have been, patriarchy along with state, the kind of intersection that there is, and drawing of borders happens through that political alignment. So I personally feel that I think women, without again essentializing it too much, I think we are always trying to cross the borders. If you look at very many texts or poetry or whatever that you come across, you always see crossing the borders. I mean, it's very strange, but a lot of titles of poetry and anthologies, crossing borders or something like that, it comes up again and again. This question is imperative. I think this dichotomy that has got created, borders are visible and invisible, that have been pushed into our psychology in such a way that we need to demolish them with the fervor of a rebellion, with the same kind of rebellion that we might do for other things. So let us try to, there was a term in 70s and 80s, it was very prevalent, sisterhood. Are we talking about sisterhood? No, we are even going beyond that. We are even going beyond the idea of sisterhood. We are connecting. It's actually going back to what Yeats was saying. We need to connect, and we are connected, but we don't realize it. Even if our rhythms are different, but the orchestra is there as a unison.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question is from Shanti. Please unmute yourself and be brief, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for taking my question, and thank you so very much for this wonderful session. As I mentioned in my comment very briefly, that we women who write do sound resilient, rebellious, and resistant, because there is a voice within us that needs to come out, that needs to be released, and nobody, not even our own selves, can stop it. And coming to the question, this is not really a question for anybody to answer, but I'd like your opinion here. I live in Maryland, close to Razi Bhai and Aarti, and I keep like submitting my stories to the magazines here. So many of the literary magazines in the United States where I submit my stories do have the submission guidelines that no domestic violence, no misogyny, we don't want any of those things. No, that is not my focus in my writing, right? It's not, I'm not talking about that. But if you don't mention that even in the passing and the backstory, how do you really show the woman's strength? A woman who has overcome this, who has resisted this, who has survived this, and who has come out of this. How in the world are you supposed to bring out that without even mentioning any of the things that she has been through? Thank you.
Thank you. So who wants to respond to this?
Would you like to, Vasudha or Girija, or should I say something? Whatever.
Well, one thing I would say that, yes, this is something which, is very irksome, because there are many magazines which have these guidelines. Because I write poetry, basically, it's possible in poetry to symbolically, present a lot through images, to aesthetically, challenge. A narrative could be disturbed, a narrative could be turned upon its head. Without even being very explicit. But I understand that this could pose a problem for prose, particularly for fiction, it might be very difficult. Here, I think Sukrita ma'am would like to come in with her background in fiction.
Well, I personally feel that, such strictures should be banned. They themselves should be given some guidelines, as how not to put in these terms and conditions for a writer. Because everyone who may be suffering from whether it's domestic violence or any one of those things will have a different story. Just like every individual, whatever filters through us will be perceived very differently. And the expression would actually throw a greater light on some aspect, some dimension, some flash of insight. And only then would it become a good story, because it's unique, right? So I think it's a very false kind of a guideline to have. And so I think you should push for it rather than, try to find, as Vasudha, maybe in poetry, yes, it can be disguised, in the form of a symbol or something. But that disguise should not happen even in poetry. It should not happen because it's a stricture. It can happen because it becomes more powerful as a symbol. The truth becomes more powerful through that, right? And for that, even if a symbol is used in a story, it is fine. It's a poetic story. Also, I don't know, even that line, I think we have to forget, that border between poetry and short story. A short story can be sometimes more poetic than a poem, So I personally, these pictures should be.
Right, thank you. So I don't have any other digital hand, but while people are thinking or formulating their question, let me pick up a couple of questions that were posted in chat. One from Aditya Kundu. And since you brought in the example of Mahasweta Devi's Draupadi, I would like to ask you, what do you think about Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni's novels like The Palace of Illusions and The Forest of Enchantments?
I don't think that I would like to compare the two. I think the voices are extremely different. I am not very well versed with Chitra's works, but I would like to study them more, but certainly of what I've read of her, I would not put them in the same comparative mode. That's my first premise, So how would I compare? I don't know, because the starkness that you see in Mahasweta Devi is not the starkness of Chitra's. That stark confrontation with a reality. It's very real, and yet it becomes what we were just now talking about, also a symbol for assertion, right? So I would just leave it at that till maybe I've done either further thinking on it, or Vasudha, would you, or Girija, would you want to say something on this?
You're on mute.
You're mute.
Mahasweta Devi is fiercely realistic. And I don't think she's comparable to any other writer that we have just talked, that have just been referred to. Because the stark realism and the kind of naked truths that she brings out so very poignantly, I don't think that kind of a realism exists in Chitra Devakurni's fiction. I've read something of her, not really many works, but I don't think that both can be compared at all, because Mahasweta Devi is Mahasweta.
Right, thank you. Another question from Meenakshi F. Paul. Is there any specific commonality among women of Southeast Asia that binds them in the feminist discourse of the region?
East Asia, is it?
Southeast
Southeast
Asia.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that we see happening is that there are similar reactions or responses to mythology, for instance, because there is a shared cultural materiality that you see, amongst South Asia and Southeast Asia. So it's a kind of a continuum, cultural continuum, with changes happening here and there. But broadly, also the epics are shared, right? Ramayana, for instance, or even Mahabharata. They're shared, but there are differences. There are cultural differences that you see there. So what is binding is the commonality of legends, cultural material, and therefore, the defiance at the stereotype. The defiance of the stereotype that all the time is happening is similar to the stereotypes that get created across again, I'm using the word border and I've become self-conscious about it, across the border. So I think, yes, there are, but what would be very interesting is to see how, if you go beyond immediate East Asia and you go to the Far East, for instance, there what is linking them is Buddha, and there would be, again, there is a continuum, cultural continuum that you see in Asia. So while, of course, I would reject some of the ideas that the West may have to put across in terms of what is Orientalism, and Edward Said saying we've debunked it, I would say probably there is some truth in realizing that Asia as a whole can be packaged as a cultural unit, with a lot of differences. I must say that is a lot of heterogeneity there. And yet there is some commonality. What Vasudha talked about family, for instance. I think family units, faith in family, for instance, it is there. So even in East Asia, you do find in the stories, for instance, one of the stories is my sister. It seems like if you were to not know that it has come from, I think it's a Vietnamese story. I'm not sure about it, but it looks as though it could be placed in India, that story, So there is something of the way we respond to living life and the patterns that we adopt in family, marriage, institution of marriage, etc., and also preservation of tradition. We are far more conscious in this part of the world, Asia, to conserve tradition. And if modernity comes out, the truck with modernity is a common feature. While these things are taken for granted in some parts of the Western world, it's taken for granted. I'm not talking about Latin America. I'm not talking about, Eastern Europe, for instance. I'm not talking about that. But broadly, you can see cultural connections, and therefore responses are common, and therefore feminism could be also seen to have some common elements.
And if I may add, speaking for myself, not only just talks about shared commonalities, but it also seems to celebrate differences and very strongly, very powerfully.
All right, thank you. Nazir Saab, you're next.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you again, professors, for this brilliant exposition of women's voices across Asia. My question relates to the element of empathy in the dialectic between men and women. All through the ages, human civilization has somehow, in most cultures, accepted the division between men and women of protection and sustenance, protection from the men's side and sustenance from the women's side. And as has been brilliantly portrayed in here, history and culture, the constraints imposed on women by its very nature, freedom imposes constraints. And women have been constrained by history and culture. But there are also other constraints imposed by politics, nationality, economic dominance, ideology, and so on. While we say, yes, the bird has to fly, but if the bird does fly, then it also becomes susceptible to the gun of the hunter. So the empathy that I'm talking about is as we think of shifting paradigms, is that element of empathy for men absent from the dialectic?
I think this is very interesting. And again, this is something that needs to be questioned because, see, the idea of when we talk about patriarchy, for instance, I think a man is as much a victim of patriarchy as a woman is. And it's very important to keep that in mind because only then can we fight that out, that system that is kind of, and I'm using it as repeatedly say, like an umbrella term, of power and authority. And there is a need to question that structure. There has been a need forever, but because we have internalized it all so much, men and women, that is why we are not able to see where we tend to glide or slip into patriarchal structures again and again, through the institutions, through the rituals that we practice, or even the way we practice religion, the role playing that we do in the family, for instance. We just slip into those structures unwittingly because of the conditioning, which is almost it's gone into our genes, And there are vested interests that it should go on. People who acquire power that way want to retain it. And therefore, it's very difficult to question that. So, of course, there is empathy for each other. Man, woman, 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 man, etc., etc. There has to be empathy. It is humankind that we are talking about. We need to have a macro vision for that, because then we will see that there's not only empathy, but there is a common cause for us to, to retain our autonomy, each one, to realize the dignity of that autonomy, to be able to give respect to the autonomy of the other, right? The autonomy of the other is also extremely important for us to remain peaceful and harmonious. And that is what, see, the intervention of power game, which is politics of a certain kind, that ruins it all. Literature can take care of it.
Yeah, I also just want to make a little point here, to add to what Sukrita ma'am says. that it is also, patriarchy, it is sexism, leads to patriarchy. And then patriarchy is also deeply allied with what we understand as capitalism. So industrialization, capitalism, and the idea of alienation, because men have always been a part of the workforce. And the idea of alienation, which has actively been allied with capitalism, has helped to bring about that kind of, the lack of empathy that we are talking about in men. Whereas, when we have spoken about the family, the idea of women's networks together, or, in previously we had these women's quarters, the Zenana, where women were together and they bonded together at many levels in various ways. So that offered a kind of companionship to women, or that offered a kind of habit in companionship, which has somehow sustained itself. So women's networks tend to be more bonded, more empathetic as compared to men's networks. Also, when we look at different patterns of communication, there is a gender difference, and women are more capable, they are more adept at the art of communication as compared to men. So in the anthology, there's a particular story, I failed to remember the exact name. It's from Japan, and the story is about four housewives who get together, and they form a kind of club among themselves. And one of these housewives, later on, she feels, that she's not paying enough attention to her husband. And so one day, towards the end of the story, she goes to meet her husband at the station, and she finds that he gets down, gets down from the train, and though it is not raining, he takes up an umbrella. He's habituated to carrying an umbrella. He takes the umbrella and he's walking, and he's oblivious, he is unconscious of the fact that his wife is walking beside him. So that's, I think it's, carrying an umbrella in the moonlight or something. That's the name of the story.
Umbrella
So that
on a moon.
points, yes, so that points out, it's not the man's fault. It is the kind of work that he does that alienates him from the system. And he is not conscious, of the bond that he's surrounded by. So I also believe that this is a reason for reducing or eroding empathy in men, the kind of workplaces they belong to, and the way that capitalism governs these places of work.
Thank you. Dr. Vijay? Dr. Vijay, unmute yourself.
Hello, sir. Are you audible?
Yes.
Sir, just my question is to ma'am. That as we see the women empowerment through the literary texts in Indian English writing, so my question is in the context of women empowerment. As we take the example of Sudha Murthy, so in the novels of Sudha Murthy, we have Mahashweta. She has written a novel called Mahashweta. So the central character who suffer a lot, and she's suffering from a kind of disease called leukoderma. So in the context of leukoderma, that how Indian novelists, women novelists, represent that disease through the novels, right? And how women get insulted and suffered from this kinds of disease. So how this novelist Sudha Murthy represent that issues, how she raised that issues through her novel. Do you think that did she justify that character by representing a kind of disease called leukoderma?
I have not read the novel, so how does one comment on it? I have not read the novel, please.
Okay.
All right. So there are a few questions in the chat, several actually, but I'm mindful of the time also. So let me quickly see if I can pick randomly one or two. There was one question about, would you suggest some literature review for study? If you can answer in the chat, that would be great. And there was another one from Rupam Chakraborty. Do you think Fahmida Riaz also projects writing the body in the context of Pakistani feminism?
So can you please repeat this Fahmida Riaz question?
Do you think Fahmida Riaz also projects writing the body in the context of Pakistani feminism?
Oh yeah, of course. She's so conscious, and so physicality to her is very important. And of course, on the one hand, there is this ideological questioning that she does all the time. Fahmida Riaz is known for that. But she's also a very hardcore, I was going to say, hardcore woman, very hardy woman. And she's very tough. in her vocabulary. And I don't have those quotations here, but if I were to quote from that, there is physicality that kind of it's saturated in physicality, you know, of her womanliness, and therefore I think she is a feminist with a difference, actually, because there is a political side to it. There is also a denial of machism, very clearly, a denial of that within her toughness. So again, I would like to use my favorite term, androgyny. She is a very androgynous kind of a writer.
All right. I'm going to pick up a last question from the chat in the interest of time, and then I'll hand over to Dr. Ravi. What do you say about Arundhati Roy, Kiran Desai, and Rama Mehta considering feminism?
I think they're very conscious of their feminism. And it isn't as if, you know, if you were to do a detailed study, each woman of this category would have her own definition of feminist projection. So one would have to really talk at length about what are the works and how that gets projected. But they are very distinctly, very politically feminist also, all the three that you mentioned.
Okay. There are actually a couple of hands raised right now, so I'm going to just entertain these two, and after that we'll end. Dr. Abdul Jabbar.
Great. So my question is regarding the current modern events. I think we have been reading about Shahid Bagh movement led by grandmothers, women. So how do you really they have been empowered by apparently poetry, other household familial experiences? Can you comment on this movement in a brief fashion, in terms of, in spite of women being kind of subjugated or suppressed, there is element of liberation for women in that movement. Thank you.
Are you talking about the current movement of feminism?
Shahid Bagh, the anti-CAA movement.
Oh, okay.
Darling.
Shaheen Bagh.
Shaheen Bagh. Yeah, well, of course, I mean, you see women all around, whether there's parda or not is not the point. But I went and saw that for myself, and there were women who were taking the mic as much as men were taking. And that was something very positive, isn't it? That there is, if they want to rebel, they have the voice and platform for it. So it's not as if the society denies it, while they were actually placed in Shaheen Bagh, there itself also, whether she were to wear the parda or not, but there was rebellion. And that is what actually, again, Isma Chuktai, you know, she did not wear the veil. And she did not wear the burqa. So when she was told to wear the burqa, she was on a journey, and the mother said, please take the burqa, you have to use it, because people are not going to appreciate you arriving without the burqa at the other end. She took it, she wore it at the station, and as soon as she got it into the train, she put it in the trunk. And she was without the burqa throughout after that, not bothered. So that kind of an inner defiance is probably there in, like somebody mentioned, that each one of us has that feeling that you need to come out, you know, that voice has to be found. Whether you deny the parda or not is another thing, you know, but your voice is given platform, that is something to be noticed. And in Shaheen Bagh, I saw that they were very active, and feminism showed its colors in a very nice way, even through posters. I saw the posters that they had put up. There were children who had done the posters also. Women, girls, you know, of all age groups. So that was a very positive response, reaction, or whatever, political defiance that you noticed out there.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is probably the last question from Aisha.
Yes, ma'am. As always, it was a pleasure listening to you. My question is basically related to a question raised 2, 3, 2-3 questions away before. As rightly pointed out by Sukrita ma'am, that not Ismat Jakhta, in fact, oh, I'm not starting my video. I'm so sorry. I'm actually sitting in a very informal attire. So yeah. So what I was saying is that she mentioned Femida Riaz. Likewise, we have Zehra Nigar. These writers are. They talk about women's rights at the same time. Their concern for women's rights and their protest against patriarchal oppression is deeply connected with their criticism as well as critique and criticism of imperialism. So Sukrita ma'am would be the right person to talk about Isma Chaghtai, these aspects in Chaghtai, as well as Quratul and Heather and other writers she has mentioned. There are many couplets that are there in my mind, but this is not the right time. And this audience can access all those writings by Riaz and Zehra Nigar and other writers. And right now, what's unfolding in front of us in in the Middle East, that too is connected with the same question: women's right, women undergoing childbirth, C-section without anesthesia, many other things we keep reading about. So again, the dose of imperialism goes somehow it gets mixed with the rights of women too. And since Sukrita ma'am talked about solidarity across Asia, that was such a lovely point. Would you further say something about the writers that you have discussed? Thank you so much.
So basically, you're talking about, this whole question of how there is a truck between feminist desire. Sorry?
Imperialism plus feminism, sorry, patriarchy.
So, patriarchy. And so the point is, see, today the world is very well connected because of the technology that we have, to communication, means of communication that we have. However, even if this sensibility of defiance and feminist rights and equality, etc., has reached all men and women, because there are, as I said, a lot of vested interests, whether it is through the state or those tendencies of, exercising power and showing its, authority in subduing the desires, rightful desires of women, whether it is that or not. But the awareness is certainly there. All literature can do is to voice that, right? And I know of, for instance, Zaida Hina's writings from Pakistan. She was not being published in Pakistan, and she got her publishers in India because she was raising her voice against those practices, the kind that you are talking about, in her own country. Now, the point I'm making is that as long as that awareness is there, there are certain strategies that are found by powerful women writers to reach across the others, voice their angst about it. And that can happen, if not on your own soil, it can happen elsewhere. But yes, there is somewhere, ultimately, Zaida was accepted by even Pakistani publishers, because she was getting so popular in India and elsewhere. And Femida Riaz went through the same thing. We know that she was in exile and she was here in India. And then finally, when she went back, she continued to be herself. So I'm basically talking about both resistance and resilience and awareness, and whether one gets autonomy or not. But I think that self-reflexivity and the question of pausing and reflecting and voicing and finding your voice, finding your language, and finding the channels to reach across. If that happens and the others can hear you, then I think in action also, probably the society will slightly evolve. Of course, we see a lot of regression also today. We do see a lot of regression in many parts of the world. But how do we address that? Those things are more political, more sociologically. We need to concern ourselves with that. But otherwise, we know that the society can be very violent to women who are justifiably asking for their rights. It's not just the society, I'm talking about the state and powers that be, So I don't think in literature, as I said, if there has to be an evolution, it can happen only slowly. Revolutions usually are very addressing the questions very temporarily.
All right, thank you. I'm going to hand over to Razibhai from here.
Okay, thank you, Faisal. Thank you. And Rafat is still in the meeting. So now I'm taking over whatever is left. There are no question or there are no hand raised. So I do not want people to think that there's no space or there's no time. If they want to come out, raise question or make comment, please do so.
There's one from Shrikant Chopra. You want to address that? Is there any other lens left to look at this issue if you abandon postmodernist wokeism point of vision?
Okay. So Shrikant Saab, if you want to say something directly, you are most welcome, or I should read your... Asha has already done. By the way, she is the professor in English department at Aligarh Muslim University, I guess. Shrikant Chopra ji, is there any other lens left to look at this issue if you abandon postmodernist wokeism point of view? So, anything to add on that question, or nothing much?
Was that the question, is it? Any other lens left? I think there would be an endless number of lenses, to look at. I don't think we have exhausted everything, but the point is that I think we need to keep asking these questions and add on to the lenses. Even they can be, I talked about how demythologization has to happen. I talked about how demystification should happen. I also talked about how literature manages to do that through reinterpretation, etc., etc. But the thing is that I think there are certain archetypes also that have been created, and those archetypes of thought processes, the way they are, and our epics, which are also propagating some of them, I think they have to be re-looked at. And proverbs, for instance, there was a project that somebody had given us long time ago, which I never got involved in too much. Look at the popular proverbs and sayings and see how much of patriarchy gets projected through that. So how do we scan that part of language? How do we do it? So that's another very important lens to be looking at. What are the kind of abuses that are used? Many of them are casteist, sexist, etc. What is the kind of humor that in common parlance is used? We need to look at that as well. So there are so many ways of, scanning our lifestyle, language, and thought processes to be able to, change the world. But we have all to join up and do that. And each one's own interest will work. And give these tasks to your younger people and let them do the research. And in doing the research, evolve different ways of, questioning the status quo. That is basically the...
So there's another question from Pratiksha Thakur. Ma'am, would you please throw some light on Inside the Haveli by Rama Mehta? Some novel or some book by Rama Mehta.
Yeah, it is, but...
Very brief, few more questions, and must be tiring for you guys.
No, it's not a question of tiring. I'm not right now attuned to this novel, Rama Mehta's. I read it long time ago, and it will be very irresponsible to, give casual statements on that.
There's one, Harshdeep, how Marxism related to feminism. I mean, you
need to read a lot of books to see, because Marxism and feminism go together to a large extent. Yeah.
You
See, different philosophers have different ways of comparison and bringing them together. Yeah. And why not read Simone de Beauvoir to understand it? She was doing that. And many of the writers that I was talking about were under the influence of Simone de Beauvoir. So,
Anyway, there's a digital hand there from Tariq Bhai.
Oh, okay. Tariq Bhai, yes, please.
Yeah, thank you for excellent discussions. You were talking about the South Asia and women and misogyny and so on. But the arc of history, as they say, is turning, it seems like. If you look at how women are doing in colleges, they're outsmarting the men, and they're doing better in most of the competitions, even in sports, which did not exist about 10, 20 years ago. And they seem to be doing better and better. And actually, I see the changes kind of escalating or accelerating, actually. So how do you see this? It takes time, and especially in the South Asian or the Asian context, but the changes are happening, and I think they're inevitable. What do you think?
yeah, absolutely. Well, why would they not happen? Because see, this process started long ago. It's not as if, and thanks to the gynocritical lens that I've been talking about, I think a lot of the literature of the past also has been re-examined. And there have been people like Susie Taru and others who have actually dug into the past, and not just the recent past, but the distant past. And they have dug out women's narratives. For instance, there is one narrative which is that of Chandravati Ramayana. And Chandravati's Ramayana is all from the point of view of Sita, for instance. So all that you read about there is, and in fact, somebody, Navinita Devson, wrote a whole piece on it and said, this particular Chandravati Ramayana should actually be called Sitayan. It's all from the point of view of Sita. So, it's Sita's growing and her puberty and her, how she grows up and how she questions Ram on several points. So the point is that, all this machinery has worked well to some extent, and people are getting exposed to these very progressive ideals and are looking at the past anew. So the past is not a frozen piece of history. It is how and what you are looking at. What is your eye discerning enough? Are you using the gender lens properly? How are you looking at it? Are you listening to the voices that were raised by Lalged, for instance, or some of these saints that I was talking about of the medieval times, women saints, how they defied patriarchy in a big way. But if you want to sort of not look at them, then you're going to only retain the status quo. But that's not happening, because there are scholars who are re-examining, re-looking at history, redefining anthropology, for instance, re-looking at mythology, looking at new psychological patterns in which a man functions or how a woman functions. So all of this is very much been happening over the last, particularly 20th century and part of the 21st century. So slowly things are changing. Yes, there is greater awareness, but suddenly some regressive things also happen. And then again, that questioning and that they have to be damned then, they have to be damned. And some raising of the voices have to happen again and again. But it's a process, and we can hope that such sessions keep happening, Razi Saab, so that, there's greater awareness.
Certainly there should be more of the kind. Well, there are some, I don't think there are other questions, just some comments, but I myself want to say something about it. I have two daughters, very much active in feminine movement here in one in New York, another in Washington. And they are very much on the street on many issues. Sometimes both tell me, I consider myself as from the progressive camp, but still they both say that you still carry the baggage of an Indian man. I mean, they don't go beyond that. You still carry, in spite of my 44 year of stay here, and all the progressive things in my pay, but still they say that you sometimes show the same thing as most of Indian men or Asian men do. In fact, here the white men also do. I mean, men, in fact, resist when they see more dynamic, smart women competing with them, I think. That's the issue of insecurity because, it's just like America. When America was predominant, it was fine. But when China and others are rising up, there is a problem of insecurity, like, beat them or press them. So there is a sort of regressive attitude also. In certain areas, even in United States, the Northeast is most liberal, the New England area, New York and all those. But when you penetrate into Deep South or Midwest, men are so conservative and women also automatically becoming the same because that's the whole cultural mellow. In India, it is also shocking to me that the educated girls or women, young women, they acquired somehow all the or copied things of the West a lot, very fast. In the cosmopolitan cities, when they have jobs and all those, they live in a very physically, they look very modern. But the problem is that mentally, emotionally, or culturally, they still are very much prisoner of their whatever their family backgrounds or their grandmothers or mothers have done. So they are not very liberated or modernist or progressive in most of cases, I find. But they have acquired a sense of freedom because they have job, they can speak English, they have degrees. Not necessarily they are very, I mean, their souls are still somehow a sort of prisoner of their surrounding. Do you see these things in India, the contradictions? Looking modern, but really not.
It's a question of, as I'll only be repeating myself, but what I'm saying is that just as you say your daughters question you, when you start questioning yourself, only then there'll be liberation. Their question should make you question yourself, because obviously they are seeing something in you because these remnants of whatever past that you have had, the kind of conditioning that you have had, unwittingly, your progressivism does not get translated as much into a progressive behavior as you would theoretically want.
The cultural conservatism, I probably,
Yeah.
that would be the
Yeah. So the same thing is true of the Indian society and what you said about, certain parts of the American continent as well. Because we know that, say, for instance, the South there, some part of it is so conservative. I know even their laws are conservative, in America. So it all depends. Here, also, there is a class structure that one is talking about. There is also we are witnessing, caste and class intersection. We are also seeing it's got not much to do with what education that they may have had. Sometimes it has a lot to do with what family orientation they have had, what kind of grandmothers and grandfathers they have, aunts and uncles they have. What are they captured by, captives of certain kind of structures of thought. But yes, there is a greater sign visible of liberation from those ideas. you also see on the regular television, whether it is from India itself or from abroad, there are greater powerful portrayals of women as as agency of liberation or of empowerment. And you do see those as icons now. So I think there are changes, and I see that as a very hopeful sign. But there is no saying how long it might take. We just need to propagate those ideas in a balanced way so that there is less of backlash and greater compliance with it. Right.
So in India, in recent 10 years, I mean, if you see the pattern of the world, I mean, obviously or scientifically, with more time, there should be more modernity, or there should be more liberation. But the recent 10 years, around 10 years of this particular regime, I'm not really doing any political statement. I'm talking about on the cultural domain or the educational domain. There are a lot of regressive things that really are seen where young minds have been, or girls especially, have been confined, sort of, targeted or confined, other than, and they again are supporting that kind of regime, which is more regressive for the intellectual growth or for the liberty of the mind. Or
So there are a lot of contradictions that you see. I mean, as you do see regressive patterns also, but one has to keep checking on that. As an educator, at least we have been very conscious, some of us, as to what our students are saying to us, what our colleagues are talking about, and we do try and check and all that. But the point I'm making is that this kind of because as I said, there is a lot of vested interest that powers remain to be what they are, and they become more and more authoritative when there is defiance. That always happens. So the greater the awareness, the greater the desire to defy, and the moment the defiance happens, the greater the repression and the oppression to it.
Sure.
It's really as simple as that. But it can be translated into a lot of action, which is going to witness contradictions then.
Thank you. This is, I think, that should end here. It is 2 hours past. Usually we do like that, almost like 2 hours. And must be very tiring for you three who are from India.
Thank you very much.
And I think such sessions should continue. So I will knock at your doors after some time, because we do every week on some subject. So it's literature, sometimes very hard politics, sometimes when the minds become very heavy, then we enter into the domain of entertainment or something, just to keep around. But it was very good, very engaging, very informative, very challenging also. This will be put on the YouTube in a week time, and then it will be in public domain. So Girijaji, very much thank you for appearing, and Vasudhara, you have a lot of talent really, and I should approach you again to invite you for, and of course Sukrita ji, we knew your father through his work. I growing up I used to read a lot of Urdu Afsana, and Jogandar Pal Sahab was one of the very favorite to everybody. There are a couple of names, Krishan, Jogandar Pal, Ramlal. Those were very famous names in Urdu stories.
Yes.
Besides some other names, we grew up with these names. Yeah.
Thank you so much for inviting. Thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk. I've enjoyed it today, and I'm very happy that there have been so many responses and questions to some Obviously, I was not aware of some of the texts, but thank you, Vasudhara, and thank you, Girija, you too, for accompanying me here. And I think we make a good team.
Very good.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Thank you
very
all.
much.
Thank you.